Greetings all, FerrariMan601 here. Welcome back to Assetto Corsa, and welcome to the A1 Ring, Österreich Ring, Red Bull Ring, Spielberg, whatever you want to call this place. Yes, we're in Austria, and we're here with this, the 1936-1937 Auto Union Type C. Yes, if you've been watching the channel of late, you'll see that I've been having way too much fun with this car, and with good reason. Coming to Assetto Corsa at the end of 2019 from none other than the supremely talented Gary Patterson over on Race Department, go get this thing, is this 1936 Auto Union Grand Prix car, Type C. Yes. Now, this car is pretty much an absolute legend. Partially for all the wrong reasons, but mostly for all the right ones. Yeah, this is quite the blast from the past. This car is 84 years old. Can you believe it? Yeah, and I've been having a ton of fun with this thing, more fun than a human being ought to be allowed to have, only because it is so different from everything else that we have in Assetto Corsa. Even the Maserati 250F that we got from, I believe it was, the Red Pack back in 2016. Yes, this thing is even crazier than that. However, there are some things about it that are just a little bit scary in terms of just how quite familiar they are. Have a look at the overall plan on this. You got a driver in the front, behind the front axle. Behind the driver is a fuel tank, and behind the fuel tank is an engine. Does this remind you of anything else that we've seen, I don't know, in the 84 years that have gone beyond the days when this car was new? Yeah, basically every open-wheeled car that has followed this general plan. Of course, we did have front-engine Grand Prix cars and front-engine Formula One cars after this, but this overall design is what open-wheeled race cars follow really since this point. This car was basically the most successful and the first successful mid-engine race car that the world had ever known. Unbelievable. Now, this is not a full-on review of this car because I don't feel like I know quite enough about it at this point to be speaking to you for an hour and a quarter or so about all of its technical ins and outs and its competition history. But what I do know about it, partially from reading about it, partially from driving it, and partially from examining my own 1/18 scale model of it, is this. We've got ourselves an Auto Union Type C. Built in 1936, 1937, this car was racing between 1936 and 1937, driven by the likes of Bernd Rosemeyer and Nuvolari, all of those kinds of guys. Yeah, absolutely incredible names and incredible provenance behind a car like this, and some incredible technology as well. Yes, it looks amazingly primitive by modern standards. It looks unbelievably terrifying by modern standards, but what if I told you that this thing had a molybdenum chassis? Yeah, molybdenum used extensively in the construction of this car. A tubular ladder frame chassis construction there made of an alloy of aluminum and molybdenum. Body panels done out of stamped aluminum, hand-formed hammers and mallets there making a lot of those body panels. Unbelievable craftsmanship going on in this era. But, of course, that's what it was. The things that this car doesn't have, though, a little bit more stark, perhaps. It doesn't have a roll structure. It doesn't have seat belts. It doesn't have power steering. It doesn't have power brakes. It doesn't have a semi-automatic gearbox. It doesn't have an electronically controlled, infinitely adjustable differential. It doesn't have radial tires. It doesn't have disc brakes. It doesn't have spring suspension. Yeah, have a look at that front end on this thing. Just two control arms there, upper and lower, but they feed into this circular device. That is basically a friction disc. Kind of like how a clutch works, you'd get the suspension arms twisting, applying a torsional force into that disc, and that disc is comprised of a couple steel plates interspersed with leather pads, creating the friction material in there. If you wanted to adjust the spring rate, you would basically remove or add leather pads in order to give the car more resistance there and make it a little bit stiffer. Nuts. Absolutely nuts. Drum brakes all around in this car, and you can see the big intake scoops there for those brakes. Drum brakes, yes, they can be very powerful, and they're still used on a lot of heavy vehicles today. However, the supreme disadvantage that they have, particularly in a racing application, is that they have absolutely no way of cooling down very quickly. So they get really hot and they stay really hot, which means, especially in these days, when the best materials you had basically were steel and ceramic, you're going to have a lot of brake fade due to heating. So in order to slow this car down, you use a combination of the brakes and the gearbox via the compression of the engine in order to effect a lot of engine braking in addition to the mechanical brakes on a car. Speaking of the engine, though, underneath this bonnet is a 6-liter V16. Yes, a 16-cylinder engine. It is the largest engine in Assetto Corsa by cylinder count, however, only displacing 6 liters. So, in other words, not terribly huge, not nearly as huge as you would expect a 16-cylinder engine to be just on the face of it. However, 16 cylinders there at 45 degrees, it is a V-block engine. Mated to a 4-speed manual gearbox in this configuration. The car later would race with a 5-speed gearbox, but interesting induction system on this engine. It is carbureted, no fuel injection quite yet in this era, neither mechanical nor electronic fuel injection. Electronics, for the most part, were still the stuff of science fiction, but that is a single carburetor. One carburetor for 16 cylinders. Why is this? Well, the engine is also supercharged. Yes, a Roots-type supercharger run off of the crankshaft. Lots and lots of low-range torque and lots of high-end power in this engine. About 520, 530 horsepower in this spec. Later on, it would be bored out a little bit more in the land speed record attempt car to make about 570 horsepower, maybe even 600, depending on which sources you read. So lots and lots of power. And remember, this is 1936. This is 84 years ago. This car is older than the vast majority of living humans. Just consider that for a moment. Whoa. However, enough about the car. Let's just drive the thing. This is not meant to be a full-on review, again, because I don't feel like I know quite enough about it yet. But for what we do know, I know that it's an absolutely insane thing to try and get your head around. So try as we will to get our head around it and just try and explain to you a little bit of how you've got to drive a car like this, because it is completely different from anything else you've ever driven. Even the Maserati 250F, it feels like the Ferrari F2004 by comparison. So you can see here, sitting in the pit lane, I love what Gary has done here in the cockpit. Just watch that tachometer there. When you run the car through Content Manager, of course, you get different instrument panel animations and displays depending on what a car actually has. But here, we have this wonderful tachometer here. The needle just bounces around here as it finds equilibrium again, trying to indicate the crankshaft RPM. Absolutely cool how it just bounces around between the revs there before it finally hits idle there at right about 1,000 RPM. Really cool. The ultimate red line on this engine is 5,000 RPM. We're going to be shifting at around 42, 4,300. That's where I find it to be happiest. But it will rev all the way out to 5,000 and a little bit beyond, but you don't want to be doing that too much. Big steering wheel in this car. Just turning it over here in the pit lane at a stop, it basically is giving me no resistance whatsoever because those tires are amazingly tiny. However, clutch in, first gear, and let's just get this thing around the track. It was an absolutely huge shock to the system for me to turn my first laps in this car, that video I did about a week ago at Spa. It is so amazingly terrifying, and I mean that in every sense. Mike Smith over there from Sim Racing 604. Hi, Mike. He asked me to describe driving this car in one word, and my response to him was harrowing. Yes, there is absolutely nothing comfortable about this. There is nothing predictable. There is nothing orthodox about this whatsoever. It is an entirely different ball game. And as you can see there, with no speed at all, we're still overshooting the corner. Yeah, we've got ourselves a lot of learning to do if we're going to be fast in this. Now, typically, on an outlap, you'd hear me talk about thinking about getting the brakes up to temperature, getting the tires up to temperature. However, not quite the case here. These tires are so amazingly rock hard, yet simultaneously, they're so small, both in their circumference and in their width, in terms of the contact patch, that basically you want to keep these things as cool as possible, which, as you can see here, pulling these big four-wheel drifts, It's not quite easy to do and not really possible to do. However, you get around that by running very high tire pressures, running 40 pounds per square inch all around. And you can see here, because we've got a car that weighs actually not all that much, all things considered, 750 kilograms, which is actually lighter than the current Formula 1 formula weight. It's about 3.9 meters long and about 1,800 millimeters wide. So actually somewhat comparable to the mid-90s, early 2000s Formula 1 car in terms of dimensions. Those tires are really working overtime. In fourth gear here, about 4,400 revs. Gonna start jumping on the brakes. You can see the brakes don't really do all that much for us. Braking distances are incredibly long. There is a lot of brake fade as you start to get toward the end of the braking zone. However, that's where the engine braking and using the transmission comes into play. You'll notice on my pedal trace in the lower left, you can obviously see all of my pedal inputs there. From right to left, accelerator, throttle, brake, and clutch. However, you won't really see me using the clutch all that much in this car. Now, why is this? Well, this is 1936 technology, remember? Synchronizers, in terms of the cone clutches that are inside most manual gearboxes for road use today, they hadn't been invented yet. As a matter of fact, that technology was invented by Porsche, as in Dr. Porsche, the same man who designed this car. So we've got basically a direct engagement crash box in this thing. And in the era, as well as today, if you've ever driven a car that has no synchronization in the gearbox, you don't really need to use the clutch, provided that you get your revs right. So you'll just see me do a big lift on the upshifts, very deliberately put it into the next gear. Same thing, bump it out of gear, blip the throttle, and then very deliberately put it into the next gear down. You do it right, you don't have to clutch. Of course you can clutch, not going to hurt anything. But the engine braking is a little bit more useful if you can just sort of slot it in like that. At over 200 kilometers an hour, that's about 120 miles an hour in a car that's 84 years old. Yet it has more horsepower than a lot of race cars do even today, with nowhere near the rigidity, nowhere near the controllability, nowhere near the safety. Actually, safety, what is the safety? The safety in this thing is making sure you don't hit anything. That's the safety. If you're going to have an accident, don't drive this. Speaking of driving this, how do you drive this? Well, as you can see, you almost never are going straight. And in addition to almost never going straight, you're almost never in control, as we just demonstrated there. The car is always in some flavor of a four-wheel drift. And of course, those of you who are in on Formula 1 history, you'll know all of the highlight reels of guys like Fangio and Moss, just very deftly guiding their cars through these very graceful slides through basically every corner. This is the same story here. However, it's a bit more challenging in this than it was in one of those, because of where the engine is and the sheer mass of the engine. Yeah, the whole car only weighs about 750 kilograms, as we mentioned, so actually very light considering how old it is. However, most of the mass is in the back. Yes, of course, the heaviest single component in here is the fuel tank, but of course your fuel load is infinitely variable. So, your highest constant mass component is the engine, and the engine, of course, is mounted right in the back there behind the fuel tank. That means that with this car being reasonably long and all of that mass at the back, it becomes an inverted pendulum. Yes, that Porsche design team back in the 30s, they were very good. They understood vehicle dynamics, and they were brilliant engineers. However, they're very limited by the technology available, the tools available, so the weight distribution in this thing, to quote Niki Lauda in Rush, an utter disaster. Which means it's gonna slide, and it's gonna spin, and it's gonna drift, and it's gonna do all sorts of things. So what do you do to combat that? Well, you apply some initial D-logic, and you just very, very carefully apply your throttle and adjust your steering angle as necessary, and you carry the momentum of these four-wheel slides all the way through every corner as much as possible. It's not always possible to do this. Sometimes you get it wrong, but when you do get it right, you're just balancing the car on the throttle, and you're just using the steering basically to counter the torque effects brought in. Because, of course, with an engine this size, with that many cylinders, it has a lot of reciprocating mass. So you're going to get a lot of torque, almost like a propeller aircraft, where you get torque effects as you bring the power up. Same thing here. You just got that linear rotational force going longitudinally through the car, and it's going to flex the chassis. And as the chassis flex, you're going to get a force from the rear that's going to be pulling you toward the outside of the corner. And you've got to balance that out with your throttle input as well as your steering, just to make sure that the arc just doesn't continue to get a wider and wider and wider radius, and then eventually you end up in the countryside someplace. It is very similar to drifting a contemporary car, with the exception that you have a lot more inertia on one end versus the other. So it's the same technique, it's just magnified. Magnified in terms of the moments of inertia, and it's diminished quite a bit in terms of the control that you actually have. It is the finest of fine lines, and it does not give you any second chances. See what I did there? I locked the rear axle because I got my downshift wrong, and that was enough. You get no second chances. Of course, also you've got to remember, a track like this, as we really make this terrible now, that's what I mean, the rear end's just pulling the car through these spins. But you also have to remember that these kinds of corners where they're both on camber and off camber, this car wasn't at all designed to be negotiating sections of track like this. Remember, the places where these cars would have done their bidding, mostly public roads, some of which weren't even entirely closed for the Grand Prix. Very few purpose-built circuits existed in this era. Of course, yes, a few did exist. There was Donington, there was Monza, and to an extent, the Nürburgring Nordschleife. However, that to this day is still public road to a large extent, so back then it was even more so. But they would have been designed as a public road, so most of your corners would be on camber for better drainage and better grip for your everyday motorist. You wouldn't have these super tight apices here like you have here in turns 1 and turn 2 here in Austria. So you would have had a little bit more wiggle room in terms of planting the car through the corner and using the camber of the road to help you out. We don't have that luxury through most of the corners here. It's a little bit more challenging. However, once you hurry up and wait, you get all of that eagerness out of your system, you start to understand what it wants to do. And you just sort of deal with it. Divide, conquer, adapt, and drive. Here's first gear to get that right. There we are. See, get the downshifts right, and that engine braking helps you a lot. Just carry that drift, balancing on the throttle and counter steering as much as you need, all the way through the corner, and all the way down the straight, and all the way through the next corner. And a lot of wheel spin worked up there, that's fine. Just sort of let the car determine how much steering angle it wants. I'm holding my steering wheel very loosely as the back end starts to break free. I'm just trying to let the car tell me what it needs rather than me consciously dialing in a given amount of steering angle. Again, these are things that you do in drifting modern cars. However, those weird half spins don't happen nearly as much in modern cars. Again, it's just that inertia of that gigantic engine in the back. Constantly wants to pull you away from where your nose is pointing. Let's just try to make this as clean a lap as possible. Lots of wheel spin there, lots of smoke in the mirrors. I'm sure that looks cool. Down through the gearbox. Get into first. Let it slow itself down. Just the slightest tap on the throttle gets the back end around, and then we're out of the corner. All that torque. Fourth gear already. 230 clicks thereabout. There's 100 kilometers an hour coming back down. Lots and lots of oversteer into understeer into oversteer again onto the grass. That didn't work. It really didn't work when you overcorrect. I just want to do one clean lap so we can get a representative time here. Under 2 minutes is possible. This I know. Yep, too much. See, you have such a small margin. It is the slightest of margins that you have. And weirdly, it seems easier at higher speeds. Which again is something that you've got to get your mind around. Let's do this properly. Kilometers an hour. Already threw it away. Oh, too much. See, once you get into that half spin, though, there's no recovering it. It's just too far gone. that's better that time. First gear is really important for getting this thing slowed down. A lot of people already have commented things like, first gear is useless, don't use first gear. Like, clearly you've never driven this thing. Just let the car twist its way around the whole way. Man, how cool it would be to be able to talk to somebody like Rosamaya or Malari today. Even be able to talk to somebody like Fangio. I mean, what would he have done in a car of a similar vintage? So Sterling Moss, you can still ask him, what were these like? I don't know if he ever drove anything that was like this, but I'm sure he would well imagine what it was like. Too wide. Well too wide. So close, but not quite close enough. And you can see just how far down the rabbit hole you can go. I really just want to do a clean lap, because I know we can do less than 2 minutes. To do 3 laps, it's going to take us 33 liters of fuel. That's something. Let's put some new tires on it. Let's repair all damages that are here. This may take about 17 minutes. Let's see. Oh, wow. This is going to take a long time. Never done a pit stop in this before. Oh, yeah. It's very, very much in bullet time, shall we say. Super slow. And interesting that they're using wheel guns here. Because those are very much knockoff hubs, as you can see. We're still only about 40% of the way done with our mechanical repairs. Give me some time to have a swig of water here, as these guys normally would have done in pit stops, or, you know, the alcoholic beverage of their pleasure. Yeah. Yep. Not too much happening. How's the weather, friends? Oh, yep, looks like it might rain in an hour. That's cool. We'll be about 10% of the way done with the race by then. Pre-war Grand Prix. Long races. 400, 500, 600 miles. They take all day in a lot of cases. All right, we're done. All right, we got fresh tires on board. Not that it really matters all that much. Fresh tires, the transmission is still a bit knackered. Look at that, 87 seconds down on the Delta. Up some grass, that's okay. These cars actually were designed to run on some really questionable surfaces, so grass not as much of a problem in this as you might think. Let's use the throttle and the steering. Gotta go back to school for this. I do wonder how the drift crowd is going to get on with this. Some of the more obnoxious people in sim racing are the people who do drifting or try to emulate illegal street racing. However, something like this might actually play well into their hands. First gear. But really, just consider this for a moment. 1936. When this car was built, when this car was racing. The automobile as we know it had only existed for about 50 years by this point. And in terms of taking on a form that we would readily recognize today, it only had existed about 15, 20 years up to this point. The fastest way to cross the Atlantic in 1936 was not by aircraft, at least not by a conventional aircraft. Fastest way to cross the Atlantic was actually via dirigible. Yes, ships like the Graf Zeppelin and the Hindenburg. They were all running in these days, and yeah, 3 days across the Atlantic. Yes, could be yours on the Hindenburg. What else was going on in this era as we spin again? Well, World War II hadn't quite happened yet. 1939 we'd have to wait for in order to see World War II properly break out. Of course, tensions had been building for about a decade prior, starting with the Great Depression. This era, the President of the United States was Franklin Roosevelt. Winston Churchill was enjoying a rise to fame in Britain. Of course, one Neville Chamberlain came before him. A little unknown guy named Adolf Hitler had come to power a few years prior in Germany, and his initiatives were directly behind the development of cars like these, wanting to gain prestige for socialist Germany, coming out of the absolutely black days of the Weimar Republic. Man had only achieved flight in terms of heavier than air fixed wing flight about 30 years prior. 1903, Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk. Electronic devices were not at all complex and not at all commonplace. Wireless radio transmission had really only been perfected at the turn of the 20th century. Became all the more popular by none other than the loss of RMS Titanic, which at this point in history was a mere 20 years ago. There was no such thing as the transistor. If you wanted any sort of semi-autonomous on-off switching capacity in an electronic device, it was going to be a vacuum tube. There were no computers as we know them. No semiconductors, no microprocessors. Wasn't even sure how such a system would operate, if it were even possible. Here's our 159-767. Most ships in these days were still powered by steam engines. And like we said, if you wanted to travel a long distance, but didn't want to use a ship to do it, you needed to cross an ocean, you had airships, you had dirigibles. was it. These days, Britain still had an empire. The United States had 46 to 48 states in this era. And on a personal note, my great-grandfather, who left this earth in 2018, he was already 12 years old when this car was racing. So yeah, we're quite a ways removed from the modern era here. It's kind of crazy to think that this car is closer to the 19th century than it is the 21st. But into the pits with us. Yeah, absolutely wild to consider how old this thing is and how difficult it is to drive. I mean, its modern cousins, the Formula One cars and Indy cars of the world, they bear no resemblance at all from a driving perspective. In terms of engineering, yeah, they are very, very much related. I mean, if you wanted to use a linguistic analogy to understand just what this is and where we've come from this point, a car like this, if we're talking about the Romance languages, a car like this is Latin. Classical Latin is spoken in Rome. Perhaps the post-war Formula One cars are modern Italian. Very close in a lot of respects, but still markedly different. Perhaps the Indy cars of today and the Formula One cars of today, well, perhaps they're Spanish in comparison to Classical Latin. Still intelligible. Still, if you put a Roman in modern Spain or modern Mexico, they can still have a cogent conversation. But there's going to be a lot of things that are lost in translation, but still you can see the family resemblance. Very much the case here. This is the beginning of it all as far as open-wheel race cars are concerned, especially given the mid-engine layout open-wheel race car. I mean, there it is. There's your nose and front axle. There's the driver fuel tank engine and rear axle and gearbox. Yeah, it's all there. All those many 84 years ago. Pretty remarkable. Again, I still have a lot of work to do before I feel ready to do a proper review on this car. Just wanted to bring you into the cockpit and drive it a bit and show you how difficult it is to drive this thing, because it is atrociously horrible to drive in a lot of respects. It is such a challenge. The car is supposed to feel terrible because we have this mindset nowadays that is biased toward what we know, what we have today. And of course, we spend a lot of our time trying to perfect our techniques in cars that are actually relevant today. Something like this, nobody who is still alive today drove this car in competition. So we don't have any first-hand sources to tell us about what these things were like. The people who designed these cars and the people who ran these cars are all also long dead. So it's all just trying to reconstruct what might have been. And just as Gary has done in making this mod and making these physics, and I'm sure he's done his homework too in trying to find pictures of this car and look at reproductions and look at a couple of the actual authentic survivors that still run today. But, you know, we kind of try and figure out what it must have been like and try to reconstruct for ourselves, hey, this is what these absolutely crazy sons of bitches did in the days of yore, and maybe we could do that ourselves now. Again, a full review is going to follow on this. I just have to get more educated on what this actually is and get even better at driving it, because as you can see, I still have quite a ways to go in that regard, but Just wanted to do a little something here. Wanted to give you guys a commentated piece as well, just to show you, hey, we're still doing this YouTube thing. And yes. So, yep, I've got hot laps here at the end, just so you can see what this car looks like pounding around here. Again, a proper review is going to follow in time. I don't know exactly when that's going to be, but it will follow, and I'm sure we'll have many more things to talk about at that point. But stay tuned for the hot laps, everyone. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you very much for watching, and of course, we will see you soon.